Okay, this will be the first video on the anatomy and physiology of the pituitary gland. We're going to look first at the kind of where the pituitary is in the brain, what its relationship is to the hypothalamus and other related areas. That's all part of what's called the diencephalon. Then we'll look at the pituitary in detail, the anterior and posterior pituitary, do a quick review of all the basic hormones, and then in the next videos we'll look at the anterior pituitary hormones in detail, and then the posterior pituitary hormones. So in order to kind of locate the pituitary and the hypothalamus in relationship to other brain structures, it's helpful to use what's known as the triune brain hypothesis. And this was put forward by Paul MacLean, who was a physician in the 1950s and 60s. And MacLean sort of proposed that evolutionarily the brain has gone through three stages of development in vertebrates. Now, there's a lot of controversy about this idea because it's not quite this simple, but I think it's helpful just for looking at functions of the brain to organize it this way. So the first part is what he called the R complex. This is the oldest part of the brain. This is essentially the brainstem and the cerebellum. And this relates, really organizes a lot of our instinctual survival behaviors. We might say this is the root of our ancestral memory. It's really the seat of all of our unconscious life activity. So regulation of your cardiovascular center, your respiratory center, digestion, everything happens unconsciously in the brainstem. The next evolutionary development in the brain is what MacLean referred to as the old mammalian brain. Today we relate this to the limbic system, and this includes really the region known as the diencephalon, which I'll get into here in just a minute, and the lower parts of the cerebral lobes, which is part of the limbic system. And this is really the seat of our emotions, aspects of our personality, a lot of our memory functions. This is where the hippocampus is with memory formation, the seat of our instincts, our feeding, fighting, fleeing, and sexual behavior. This is all regulated by areas such as the hypothalamus, and so forth. So we might relate this more to our subconscious mind. We have awareness of emotions and these impulses, but we're not quite fully conscious of them. So that's why some refer to this as the subconscious mind. And then the newest part of the brain development is the neocortex, and this includes the cerebral cortices, the outer regions of the cerebrum. And this is the seat of our higher thought activities, our language processing, our spatial location, and that sort of thing. So this is what MacLean thought was sort of the latest evolutionary part of the brain. Now, others have gone further and proposed that actually there is a fourth region that's still in development, and that would be the prefrontal lobe. The prefrontal lobe is the seat of what we might call our executive mind. It's the part that's able to look in on the other parts of the mind, look at our thought processes, look at our emotional processes, and maybe even in practicing different states of meditation, actually be able to access what's happening in the brainstem in that activity. I won't go into all that. That's more part of neurology and neuroscience and psych here. But I think it's interesting to note that, the brain is, of course, not a fixed thing. It's under constant development. There's a lot of neuroplasticity, and there's still parts that are developing. Interestingly, going back to the limbic system, where we cite that this region is sort of the part of the emotional mind, there's a lot of interesting data looking at how through autonomic nerves, specifically the vagus nerve, about 80% of vagal fibers are sensory, and they are essentially sensing what's happening in your organ systems, your heart, your liver, your kidney, and bringing that metabolic information back to the limbic system and mapping it there. So the thalamus, which we'll look at here shortly, is one region where those organ sensory activities are mapped. So that's an interesting idea, that our emotional life is not so much sited in the brain. It's really something that's part of a whole body experience. So the whole vision of having a brain in a vat, which we can, put our consciousness into, is part of a misnomer. That brain would be able to think, but we can argue that it might not be able to feel because it's not connected to the rest of the body through those autonomic connections. So the area we're going to be interested in is, of course, the hypothalamus and pituitary, which is right here in that limbic region in the diencephalon and part of the emotional brain. So the diencephalon is part of the limbic system here. It's really considered to be a division of the forebrain. So in embryonic development, remember we have these 3 cerebral vesicles that develop at the end, the cranial end of the neural tube. And we can divide that into 3 regions, and the most cephalic region is the forebrain. It's known as the prosencephalon, and that is divided into the cerebrum and the diencephalon. So the diencephalon really sits between the cerebrum and the midbrain, which is the next structure there. So centrally located in the brain. And this is really where we do a wide variety of sensory and motor processing between the higher and lower brain centers. So all of these structures in the diencephalon really are clustered around the third ventricle. Remember the ventricles, we have the first and second ventricles, and then the third ventricle is sort of right in the middle of the brain, and contains the cerebral spinal fluid. So the thalamus wraps around the third ventricle. We have 2 lobes of the thalamus. And then we have the hypothalamus just anterior to that. So if you look at the picture over here, here's the thalamus, and between these 2 lobes is the third ventricle, and then the hypothalamus just anterior to that. And then the pineal gland is part of what's known as the epithalamus. So epithalamus sometimes people equate with the pineal, but epithalamus technically also includes other surrounding tissues around the pineal, and that's located behind the thalamus. And if you look at it, it's just behind, going down to this picture here, over here. So this is the midbrain structure here, and the pituitary is, the pineal gland is right back there behind the midbrain. So we'll look at that in more detail in the pituitary section. Interestingly, it's located actually right between the 2 what are called superior colliculi, and these are little projections off the back side of the midbrain which are involved in visual motor organization. So when you move your eyes, you track different things with your eyes. That involves the superior colliculi. So it's interesting, that connection with the pineal and vision. We'll look more at that connection in actually in different lower vertebrates. The pineal gland actually has light sensing cells, and it acts as a sort of third eye in those organisms. Okay, so that's the epithalamus. Then we have the subthalamus, which is below the thalamus, and then the optic nerve also passes through this region. So the optic chiasm, where the optic nerves cross, is actually right between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And the pituitary, also known as the hypophysis, hangs down by a little stalk called the infundibulum. And that'll be important for when we look at the differences between the anterior and the posterior pituitary. So those are the structures of the diencephalon. The thalamus itself, you probably remember, is really a region that we can think of as a sensory relay station. So sensory impulses, both conscious but also unconscious, are coming up from the brainstem. They go through the spinal cord, through the brainstem up to the thalamus, and they are mapped into the thalamus. So we have sort of a sensory homunculus in the thalamus, which is not as finely differentiated as the sensory homunculus that's up in the cerebral cortex in the somatosensory area. But it is important for mapping things like pain. So there's an interesting phenomenon known as thalamic pain syndrome, where people get maybe a stroke in the thalamus or some trauma or injury there, and they have the inability really to filter pain. So they have extreme pain even to non-painful stimuli, allodynia, and things like that. Okay, so thalamus really is comprises the majority of the diencephalon, 80%. It's really 2 oval masses of gray matter. Again, it surrounds the third ventricle. It's just above the midbrain. And there are 9 different regions, 9 what are called nuclei. Remember, a nucleus in the central nervous system is a collection of nerve cell bodies. This is different than in the peripheral nervous system. So it's a collection of nerve cell bodies, and they all have specific activity. And these activities relate to different things, again, from sensory mapping sensory information, also filtering that sensory information, and like I said, pain information, emotion and memory. So there's something called the Papez circuit, and the thalamus is part of that. It's a motor relay station as well. So there are inputs from the motor cortex and the basal ganglia, and then outputs through the descending motor tract. So there's also a motor filtering and organization activity there. And then, of course, lesions there are associated with motor and sensory deficits, and that's part of the thalamic pain syndrome. Just a technical note, the blood supply to the thalamus is from the posterior cerebral artery, so any infarction along that artery could result in damage to the thalamus. So hypothalamus then is the region just below and anterior to the thalamus. This is really going to be of interest to us because this is the major regulator of homeostasis. It's just about the size of an almond, but it has incredibly important properties here. Within that small space, there are about a dozen nuclei that are organized in 4 major regions. We went through a couple of the regions in the last videos, looking at the anterior and posterior and the lateral and medial regions. And then the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary via that little stalk called the infundibulum. So what does the hypothalamus do? Really, this is the link point with the pituitary between the nervous and the endocrine system. It regulates our eating, drinking, sleeping, and sexual behavior. Controls really the sympathetic parasympathetic balance, although many of the nuclei, for example, for the parasympathetic nervous system, the vagus nerve, are down in the brainstem. It's the hypothalamus which ultimately regulates that activity, though. Production of hormones, of course, through the pituitary, regulation of emotions and behavior, etc. Body temperature is a big one, regulation of circadian rhythms, and we should say body weight as well. So body mass, we think in the hypothalamus there are actually set points for temperature. So a good example would be, you have your daily temperature, which of course has a circadian rhythm. But if you have inflammation in the body, you release cytokines, IL-1, IL-6. They are able to get to the hypothalamus. There are regions in the hypothalamus that are actually not separated from the bloodstream by the blood-brain barrier. So we're able to directly sense what's going on in the bloodstream. And so the cytokines are able to reset the thermostat in the hypothalamus. So maybe it's reset a couple of degrees higher to maybe 101 degrees Fahrenheit. And so then the hypothalamus will activate the sympathetic nervous system and the hormones to essentially initiate catabolism to try to stimulate more body heat production. And so you'll go through a period where until you get to that set point and you're not quite at that new temperature, you'll actually have the sensation of chills. And the chills is really where you're moving from your normal set point up to that new one. And then once you reach that set point, then you have fever. So that's one example of a set point, and then when the inflammation goes down, that drops down. Another example would be, again, body weight. So we think that there is sort of an unconscious or potentially subconscious programming around body weight, which is an interesting topic. There are a number of programs using hypnosis and these different things to try to change that set point. I won't really go into that, but that's, I think, an interesting area to explore. But others argue there are set points for pretty much everything. Our physical appearance, even things like more intangible, like how much money we'll make, and these different things are potentially programmed into the hypothalamus and probably other regions as well. So I think that's interesting from the perspective that although there might be a programming there, that programming could potentially be changed with different inner techniques. And so I'll just leave it at that. So that's the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and we'll talk about the epithalamus and pineal in the later videos. Okay, in the last slide I mentioned that the hypothalamus has about a dozen different nuclei, and it can get confusing to look at all these, but let me just try to sort through a few of them. These kind of questions are sometimes asked on boards, and so it's good to have a general overview, but it'll be important for us in endocrinology as well to understand some of the major regions of the hypothalamus. So I've kind of correlated these diagrams with the kind of table below here. So one of the first regions to look at is the anterior hypothalamic nucleus. So that's only seen here in the picture here to the right. So here is, by the way, the front of the brain. This is towards the front. Here's the back. Here is the infundibulum, and here's the anterior and posterior pituitary. And this is right on the upper side of your nasal passage. So this is really looking sort of, if you go between the eyes, look straight in, you're seeing this different regions of the hypothalamus. So the anterior hypothalamic nucleus, this is our major parasympathetic nervous system regulation area. So this is involved with actually dropping your body temperature with heat dissipation. So lesions here would result in hyperthermia. The posterior hypothalamic nucleus over here, and this is down here on the table. Sorry, it's not all together here. So posterior hypothalamic nucleus, this is really where your sympathetic nervous system is regulated. And when this area is activated, it tends to increase heat production in the body. And so lesions here would result in poor thermal regulation. So that's the anterior posterior hypothalamic nuclei. The preoptic area, and specifically the supraoptic nucleus. So again, we can see those on this picture here that's right above the optic nerve, supraoptic nucleus. This is very important in that the supraoptic nucleus is the source of antidiuretic hormone. And that's actually going to be secreted in neurons there, and it's going to pass, these neurons will pass down the infundibulum to the posterior pituitary, and the antidiuretic hormone will be stored in little vesicles there. And we'll talk about the various things that trigger their release. They'll be released into the bloodstream, and then they'll have downstream effects in the body, primarily on the kidneys to prevent diuresis. So that's the supraoptic nucleus. The paraventricular nucleus, PVN, which is up here, and then you can see on either side here, the PVN is the source of oxytocin. And oxytocin as well, there are neurons that will reach down into the posterior pituitary and release oxytocin. They'll actually be stored in little vesicles there. And again, there'll be different triggers for their release into the bloodstream. And some of the major roles of oxytocin, as we'll see, will be to stimulate uterine contractions during labor, but also to initiate what's called the milk letdown reflex to begin breastfeeding. So that's oxytocin. And several others, including a little bit of antidiuretic hormone, comes from the PVN as well. Suprachiasmatic nucleus, we talked about that in the previous videos. That's here. This is very important in that it is the site of our 24-hour circadian clock. And the suprachiasmatic nucleus is receiving nerve fibers from the optic nerve, which again are tied in with those blue light-sensing ganglion cells in the retina. And they're entraining us to a 24-hour day or solar rhythm. Let's jump down to the lateral hypothalamic area, LHA. This is our feeding center. So if you stimulate this, this increases eating. So we can think of the lateral nucleus causes you to grow laterally. It's also the source of orexin, and lesions here result in starvation. The mammillary body is just seen in this picture down here. The mammillary body is what becomes damaged in chronic alcoholism, and this is what leads to or involved with Wernicke encephalopathy and Korsakoff psychosis, which includes confusion, amnesia, and ataxia. And that's often due to B1 thiamine deficiency. This area is also involved in memory formation, part of the Papez circuit. And that involves the hippocampus, area called the fornix, the mammillary body, and then the anterior nucleus of the thalamus. The ventral medial nucleus, that's here in the blue up above. Ventral medial nucleus is also involved in feeding, but this is actually our satiety center. So if you stimulate this area, it results in decreased eating. So we can think of the ventral medial nucleus causes you to shrink medially. Lesions here result in obesity, hyperphagia, and what we call savage behavior, basically eating anything that's in sight. And then the arcuate nucleus, this is an interesting region. That's the one in pink here. And then you see it down at the base here. The arcuate nucleus is actually the source of dopamine, which is going to be used in the anterior pituitary to suppress prolactin secretion. So that's going to be important because deficiency of dopamine can actually cause excess secretion of prolactin. Okay, so those are some of the major regions of the hypothalamus. You don't need to memorize all those. But no, again, some of the bigger ones, especially the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the paraventricular nucleus, and the supraoptic nucleus, and the arcuate nucleus, and what their roles are. So now let's look at the pituitary, or the hypophysis, in detail. We can think of this as our master gland, although it's quite small. It's about 1 centimeter in diameter. It's really about the size of a pea. But this little gland regulates pretty much all of your major hormone secretions from all the glands in the body. It lies in a little bony cavity called the sella turcica. This is named after the shape of a Turkish saddle. So this is right above, if you look inside the nose, go into the nasal passage, this is right on the upper side of the nasal cavity. This is the sphenoid bone, and then the pituitary lies inside that cavity. And then again is connected to the hypothalamus via the infundibulum. Here is the optic chiasm where the optic nerves cross, and then here's where the hypothalamus is. So again, just above the eyes and above the nasal passages. It's covered in dura mater. The only part is right here where the infundibulum connects with the hypothalamus. There's no dura mater, but the rest of it is covered in dura mater. There's also arachnoid and pia mater, of course. The infundibulum itself actually contains nerve fibers, but also blood vessels. And there's a little portal, what we call a portal circulatory system. I'll show you in detail on the anterior portion of that. The pituitary is really composed of 2 major lobes with an intermediate lobe. So the anterior lobe is known as the adenohypophysis, and that embryologically actually arises from the ectoderm. Remember, ectoderm gives rise to all of your nervous system tissue, but specifically from an area called Rathke's pouch, which is on the anterior side of the oral mucosa. So we can think that there's a connection there actually with the digestive system in a way through Rathke's pouch. So that arises from oral ectoderm. There are 5 different types of cells within the anterior pituitary. These are all endocrine secreting cells, and they in turn are going to be regulated by hormones from the hypothalamus. So there's, in the case of the anterior pituitary, there's going to be a hypothalamic releasing hormone, which will then travel down a little portal circulatory system in the infundibulum, and that will then cause the release of hormones from the endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary. Now, in the previous slide, I mentioned that the paraventricular nucleus, the PVN of the hypothalamus, is the source of oxytocin for the posterior pituitary, but it's also the source of a number of releasing hormones for the anterior pituitary. And so there are specific cells called parvocellular neurosecretory cells in the PVN, and they release these hypothalamic releasing hormones directly into what's called the hypothalamo-pituitary portal system. So let's look at that in this picture down here. So here is the hypothalamus up here. Here are, on this side here are the posterior pituitary secreting neurons, and they actually reach all the way down through the infundibulum, and then they synapse onto, they don't synapse onto, but they actually project onto a little circulatory system in the posterior pituitary. So blood is coming in through this artery, the superior hypophyseal artery, and it's going to flow through, let's just focus on the posterior pituitary here first. By the way, that's called the neurohypophysis. It's going to flow through the neurohypophysis, and it's going to then leave via this venous drainage. These neurons up in the hypothalamus project down, and they will release their hormones directly into the bloodstream here in the posterior pituitary. As I mentioned in the previous slide, they can actually store the neurons at the ends of the axons in little vesicles. So there is some storage of oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone there. But the anterior pituitary is a lot more complicated. So what happens is these neurons up in the PVN, project down onto a little portal circulatory system in the infundibulum. And then they release what are called releasing hormones into that circulatory system, which travel down into the anterior pituitary, and they are going to cause the anterior pituitary secreting cells down here in little clusters to release their hormones into the bloodstream. So it's a kind of a two-way street. We have first a hypothalamic releasing hormone that goes down and it's released into the hypothalamo-pituitary portal system. That's going to travel down to the anterior pituitary, and that'll cause the anterior pituitary cells to release their hormones. Versus posterior pituitary, it's very simple. The neurons just project right down onto the blood system in the posterior pituitary. So we'll have to look at, with the anterior pituitary, with each of the hormones, what are the hypothalamic releasing hormones. But the majority of them are made up here in the PVN of the hypothalamus. Okay, so that's the adenohypophysis or anterior lobe. The posterior lobe, again, is called the neurohypophysis. And this is more simple embryologically. It actually arises straight from the neuroectoderm, from the brain. So that's why we have really two activities here. We can say the anterior pituitary arising from Rathke's pouch, and the oral ectoderm is almost more metabolically, digestively related, versus the posterior pituitary is more directly related to the nervous system, so the wiring is a little simpler. So we can think of the posterior pituitary really as an extension directly of the hypothalamus. Again, the neurosecretory cells are called magnocellular neurosecretory cells versus the parvocellular neurosecretory cells for the anterior pituitary, and they arise from the supraoptic and the paraventricular nucleus, as we discussed. And then there's an intermediate lobe between these two, and that secretes melanocyte stimulating hormone. This region is avascular, and it's very, very thin in humans, so we don't think it's particularly active in humans. Although in other mammals, this region, by secreting melanocyte stimulating hormone, helps determine the color of the coat of the animal. So the fur color and whatnot, the amount of melanin and so forth is determined by MSH secretion. Okay, so that's the two major lobes with the third intermediate lobe of the pituitary. Most of these pituitary and hypothalamic hormones are released again in a circadian rhythm, and they're released in a pulsatile or burst-like manner. So we'll see, for example, with the gonadotropins, LH and FSH, from the anterior pituitary, that gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, from the hypothalamus is released in a pulsatile manner. And if the pulses are slow, then the anterior pituitary cells release FSH in response to that. If the pulses are speeded up, they release LH instead. So that's interesting. Again, it's not just the hormone, it's also the rhythm of the hormone, which is important here. Okay, so we'll look at the rhythms of all those individual hormones as we go. All right, so let's do a quick sort of overview of the anterior pituitary here first. Again, it's connected to the hypothalamus via the infundibulum and that little hypophyseal portal circulatory system. And there will be neurosecretory cells, the parvocellular neurosecretory cells up in the PVN of the hypothalamus will release, project down onto this little portal circulatory system, and they'll release their releasing hormone into that system, and that'll cause the release of the various anterior pituitary hormones. So there are 5 different types of endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary. We name them somatotrophs, thyrotrophs, gonadotrophs, lactotrophs, and corticotrophs, and that'll make sense here in just a second. And they secrete both tropic hormones and trophic hormones. So trophic hormones, again, are hormones that act directly on target cells to release hormones. So for example, TSH is a tropic hormone for the thyroid gland. It causes it to release thyroid hormones, versus a trophic hormone like growth hormone directly acts on tissues and stimulates growth in those tissues. So you'll see both of those terms used interchangeably sometimes. They are technically different though. So let's look at all of the various pituitary hormones here. So the first one, and by far the largest secretion of the anterior pituitary, is growth hormone. The releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is growth hormone releasing hormone, also known as somatocrinin. So GHRH causes somatotrophs in the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. Now, growth hormone itself is not particularly active. It has to actually enter circulation, where in the liver, receptors for growth hormone stimulate hepatocytes to release insulin growth factors, or somatomedins. And the biggest one is IGF-1. And so IGF-1 circulates around the body, and that's what actually stimulates growth in muscle, cartilage, bone, and so forth. It's an interesting idea in Chinese medicine that the liver regulates the tendons and the sinews. Interestingly, that could be seen as the effect of insulin growth factor from the liver on the repair of ligaments and tendons and so forth throughout the body. All right, so that's growth hormone. A couple of other effects of growth hormone we'll see is it can actually elevate blood glucose, and that can certainly be a good thing during stages of growth, but not a good thing if you're an adult. If you're taking growth hormone therapy, we'll talk all about that. That can lead actually to premature diabetes. There is an inhibitory hormone, so that's going to be an important discussion here too. Just like there are hypothalamic stimulating hormones, there are also inhibiting hormones, and the main one for growth hormone is growth hormone inhibitory hormone, which is also known as somatostatin. You've probably heard of that one. That acts also as an inhibitory hormone in the gut for a lot of, for example, pancreatic secretions. So that's somatostatin. The next hormone here is thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. It's released by thyrotropes when they are triggered by thyroid releasing hormone, TRH. So TRH is a stimulating hormone. And again, somatostatin is an inhibitory hormone for TSH. And this TSH will circulate in the blood. There are receptors for it in the follicular cells of the thyroid, and that will stimulate them to release the thyroid hormones, primarily T4 and a little bit of T3. TSH also stimulates the growth of the thyroid, and that can be a problem if, for example, you're iodine deficient. You can't make thyroid hormones, your thyroid levels fall, and because you have low thyroid levels in the blood, the brain, through negative feedback, is going to actually increase TSH secretion. TSH will stimulate the thyroid gland to grow, try to make more thyroid hormone, but because there's no iodine, you can't make the hormone, your hormone levels remain low, you secrete more TSH, your thyroid enlarges, and you get a goiter. So that can be a negative thing. So we'll look at all the effects of TSH in the thyroid section. CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, is the main releasing hormone for corticotropes to release ACTH. Notice we have not discovered an inhibitory hormone here yet. So ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to release primarily glucocorticoids, and the main one being cortisol, and androgens, DHEA. You might remember that the adrenal cortex also secretes mineralocorticoids, and that would be aldosterone. It turns out that aldosterone release is primarily regulated by renin from the kidneys, not by ACTH. ACTH has a little bit of a role, but it's not the primary release of aldosterone. Okay, so that's ACTH. Prolactin is released by lactotrophs. Notice that there is no releasing hormone, which is interesting. Now, TRH we think does suppress a little bit prolactin. So if you have low TRH, then you're going to get maybe more prolactin. But the main effect on prolactin is from dopamine, and dopamine acts as an inhibitory signal to prolactin synthesis and secretion. So we also call it prolactin inhibiting hormone. So that's dopamine. And that's the main effect of prolactin is going to be on the mammary glands to stimulate milk production. High levels of prolactin can suppress FSH and LH, or so-called gonadotropins, we'll talk about here in just a second, and that can inhibit sexual function, menstruation, ovulation, can cause infertility, low libido, and so forth. So we'll talk about high prolactin states. They can happen in what are called prolactinomas, prolactin-secreting tumors of the pituitary. I'll talk about prolactin in more depth in the next little video, but prolactin has a lot of other effects in the body we're now discovering. So that's prolactin. The next one is FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, released by gonadotrophs in response to slow pulses of GnRH from the PVN in the hypothalamus. So GnRH is the releasing hormone for FSH, and FSH is going to work in females on the ovaries to stimulate follicular development and secretion of estrogen, and in males it's going to work on the Sertoli cells in the testes to secrete estrogen, and that's going to be important for sperm development. So think FSH, estrogen. The other gonadotropin is LH, luteinizing hormone. And that's also released by the same cells, gonadotrophs, but here in response to fast pulses of GnRH. So in the female menstrual cycle, in the first up between menses and ovulation, that's when FSH is primarily secreted. And that's due to slow pulses of the GnRH. And then after that, the pulses speed up and we get more LH secretion in the second half of the menstrual cycle, the so-called luteal phase between ovulation and the next menses. LH in the ovaries specifically stimulates secretion of primarily progesterone from the corpus luteum and stimulates ovulation. And then in males, it stimulates testosterone production. So that's LH. And then I mentioned melanocyte stimulating hormone from the intermediate lobe. I'll just put that here. That's also released by corticotrophs. And CRH is also a releasing hormone there. MSH, it's a little bit complicated. The corticotrophs release a large peptide in response to CRH called POMC. And POMC will fragment into ACTH as well as MSH. So whenever you make lots of ACTH, you're going to make lots of MSH. And that's important because in primary adrenal insufficiency, Addison's disease, the gland has been destroyed, usually through an autoimmune process or less commonly an infection. You get very low cortisol levels, and so the brain perceives that, starts to pump out lots of CRH and then ACTH. And in the process, it also puts out a lot of MSH because, again, the CRH will increase POMC, the POMC will fragment into ACTH and MSH. And the MSH will cause darkening of the skin. So one characteristic sign of primary adrenal insufficiency, Addison's disease, is darkening of the skin, usually in the skin folds and areas like that. Okay, so those are the primary anterior pituitary secretions. One I didn't mention here are the endorphins, beta endorphin, and that's also often released in response to ACTH. That's also going to be part of the POMC complex. So whenever you release lots of ACTH, you'll release the MSH as well as endorphins. Okay, let's jump over to the posterior pituitary. Again, this region doesn't actually synthesize the hormones, but can store and release the two hormones, and this would be oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So axons directly from the PVN and the supraoptic area project down directly onto the little blood supply, little portal system in the posterior pituitary. And these secreting neurons can synthesize the hormone. They travel down the axon. They can be stored in vesicles at the ends of the axons, and they can be stored there until they need to be released. Oxytocin, abbreviated OT, this is released primarily in response to uterine distension and nipple stimulation. But as we'll see, there's a lot of other things that can release oxytocin, and there's a lot of interest now in this hormone as having much more than just a reproductive function, but it also being related to the sort of pleasant feelings when you're in love with someone, the kind of biological effects of touch and connection we think are partially mediated by oxytocin, or at least oxytocin is an image in our physiology of that activity. But we usually think of it classically in relationship to the uterine contraction and the milk letdown reflex. I'll talk more about the other sort of ideas around that in the next little video. Antidiuretic hormone, ADH, again, this is released by the neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus, and ADH primarily is going to cause you to retain water. So we can think of really it's trying to increase your water body, your living forces, to maybe dilute out a toxin or a pathogen, if you're hemorrhaging, to try to increase your blood volume, and so forth. So it has effects on the kidneys to try to conserve water by decreasing urine output. It's going to also have effects on blood vessels by constricting arterioles, so that there's a survival benefit from the antidiuretic hormone. And there are many things that will cause it to release, like stress. A lot of times after post-surgical, especially neurosurgery, you can have excess ADH secretion. In fact, we'll see one of the characteristic pathologies of the posterior pituitary is something called SIADH, Syndrome of Inappropriate Antidiuretic Hormone. And that's going to have excess or elevated ADH. The opposite would be diabetes insipidus, which has decreased ADH. So those are our two main posterior pituitary disorders we'll go into in depth on. Okay, so that's oxytocin and ADH. So that's a quick little first introduction to all the pituitary hormones. Now we'll jump into the next video and go into each one in a lot more detail.